It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to Chris for the invitation. And you'll see there's a lot of resonances between the three papers, particularly the two responses, which is good because it shows that we were reading the same book. Ever since James Crossley, aided by Ward Blanton, drank nearly all of my very nice bottle of port when I was out, even though I'd marked it very clearly as not redneck glugging juice. I've really been looking forward to an opportunity like this. And here it is. We all know that in a British context, a little anecdote like this might not be innocent. I might be trying to position myself as a port drinker, in contrast to my redneck colleagues who do not usually, like me, drink port. One of the many important points of cults, martyrs and Good Samaritans, which is disappointingly for my revenge agenda really quite an excellent book, is to foreground what I think of as the tones and styles of truth and relatedly class. In a book I love to quote, Stephen Shapin's A Social History of Truth, Civility and Science in 17th Century England, Shapin argues that truth was, and I say still is, a matter of epistemological decorum. Truth is social and political. It's a matter of tone and pitch and credibility, which has to do with social and political status. There's a strong, but I think completely unnoticed subtext in the history of religion and philosophy, which connects truth to tones and styles. William James says that gods and truths die or live as they adjust or not to changes in what he calls mental climates or tones. In the Enlightenment, the gods that survive are the ones that stop commanding or shouting in a very, very loud voice and demanding things, especially things like blood sacrifices. The ones that survive are the ones that stop speaking in rude and vulgar tones and start to speak in tones closer to what is being formulated as the sounds and tones of reason and the voices and tones of normative values, morality, and above all, law. Kant describes fanaticism, or what he calls Schwärmerei, as something that sounds discordant, out of rhythm, hard to listen to. He describes it as a buzzing sound, like the swarming of bees. In blasphemy legislation, the wrong kind of freedom from tradition, which was called blasphemy, and the right kind of freedom from tradition, which was called criticism or freedom of expression, has often been tendentiously separated by legal tests of manners and style, and also large fines, which only gentlemen could afford. Prosecuted blasphemies, many of which were centred actually in the north of England, especially Bradford, were stark demonstrations of the sociology and politics of truth. Blasphemy has never been a matter of sola scriptura. The most controversial blasphemies have always combined an ironic distance from biblical authority with threatening social movements. For example, socialism or the campaign for birth control. The Bible, as I tell my students, and I'm sure we all do, is ta Biblia, the library, a polyphony of different voices, tones and genres. There are the censuses, the legends, the divine oracles, the letters, speaking in a Pentecostal range of tongues and cadences, from praise to protest to imperative to lament. James's book compiles a similarly polyphonic archive of the political and social nuances of biblical truth in English politics from 2008 to the present. He creates a new meta-canon and an invaluable resource that is meticulously researched. The original parable of the Good Samaritan, which you know better than I do, famously gives three different models of response: the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. In a similarly parabolic spirit, James demonstrates three very different political takes on the figure of the Samaritan: the Thatcherite, the Blairite Cameronite, and the Corbynite. So there's Thatcher's infamous gloss: the Samaritan could only help because he was a good neoliberal who'd worked hard and invested money and could therefore afford the surplus of charity. Then there's the Cameronite Blairite reading of the Samaritan used as justification for military intervention as not walking by. And then there's the Corbynite reading of the Samaritan as a call to welfare, not just as charity, but as part of the essential work of the state. James also discusses a number of conflicting reasons for politicians referencing the Bible, and a range of tones in which its truth is invoked. So sometimes, for example, Jesus is called on by those to the left of the Labour Party because he's seen to represent an acceptable and canonical biblical radicalism that can be seen as far less controversial than socialism or Marx. So Jesus is Marx light, decaffeinated Marx. Here, the left invokes the vague universalism and mainstream status of the Bible in contrast to particular political factions, which are perceived as more partisan. In the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower and others began to invoke the new term the Judeo-Christian and Judeo-Christian values, especially the value of equality, against what he called, quote, the threefold public enemy: communism, Korea, and corruption. Honestly, we're beginning with C or almost. Now, a moderate Judeo-Christian radicalism is sometimes used to stand in for socialism. But as for Eisenhower, there's a sense that the Bible somehow stands for universal, in a sense, apolitical values, the values of every man, every woman. Though he wouldn't sympathise with Corbyn and Tony Benn's Jesus, David Cameron agrees with the idea of Christian values as a vague consensus when he describes society as founded on Christian values that, quote, speak to us all, to people of every faith and none. So the Bible becomes universal truth, a source of non-contentious virtue and righteousness, the content and tone of which can be very differently understood. But at the same time, and I think James is working with lots of different tones and styles at the same time, the Bible is also invoked in a different tone, the tone of irony. Irony is a word that James uses a lot. In fact, ironic distance from the Bible links the Barrovians, this is the official term I looked up on Google, for the residents of Barrow-in-Furness. I thought James was making it up at first. And also the Westminster politicians that they so often despise. So the public discourse of politicians of all parties is characterised, James says, by, quote, sometimes ironic respect for an authoritative source of cultural heritage which will support a given political position but will not overdo anything perceived to be peculiar or alien in political discourse. Even when it speaks of a canonical radicalism, the Bible will drop all potentially alienating detail and speak in general, non-controversial tones. Citations of the Bible by the Barrovians similarly suggest, he says, a low-level nostalgic power cited at ironic distance. You can see why I think it's important to highlight what James's book does with tones. In modernity, politics is born through a public separation from religion, as Hannah also said. The Bible becomes a distant foundation. James shows how this works out in the tones of political discourse. The Bible represents a vague consensus, but it's also invoked with irony, which is the rhetorical gesture of distancing or opposition or inversion of norms. And so just as the Bible itself is a polyphonic canon, so these two tones, vague respect and irony and skepticism, are in play, often in the same sentence, at the same time. But this is not to say that Cameron and the Barrovians model the same kind of irony, or that their voices and tones are in tune. Far from it. One of my favourite moments in the book is when James reads out to the sceptical Barrovians Cameron's truly incredible list of what the Judeo-Christian roots of the Bible and Christian values have allegedly given us, and then enjoys the comic dissonance of the Moravians' response. The Bible, says Cameron, is the irrepressible foundation of equality and human rights. It also gives us constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, welfare provision, the abolition of slavery, the emancipation of women, responsibility, hard work, charity, compassion, humility, self-sacrifice, love, and pride in working for the common good. Bollocks, say the Moravians. And the tone and the exact phrasing is important. Controversies over the Bible have often been about the vulgar and the vernacular. And then they say, I cannot see how it all comes from the Bible. Hard work. What, thou shalt work hard? I don't remember that one. And the Bible talks about things that have nothing to do with democracy, so remembering the alien within the canon. I think Cameron could learn something here. When invoking the spirit of the Bible, it's best to stay with the general spirit, not the letter or the specifics. Less is more. It might be too fully expressed in a way that beggars belief, but Cameron's statement is one of the fundamental axioms of the very idea of British values. Where's the clicker? No. Okay. These values are now all over central government policy, including education and immigration. They're the linchpin of SMSC, social, moral, spiritual and cultural education in schools. And I can refer you to the expert Adam Davey, who's in the audience, age 11. He can tell you about all of this. They're also all over the citizenship test that most of us would not pass, and that I definitely would not recommend being given to the Moravians. In the citizenship test, religion is dominated by Christianity, Britishness is thoroughly dominated by Englishness, and English culture is presented as a nostalgic composite of Shakespeare, Chaucer, the royal family, cricket, the proms, the Oxford and Cambridge boat race, the Magna Carta intolerance, the TV series Coronation Street, and Sherlock Holmes. Here's some sample questions. Which of the following statements is correct? I've done this numerous times, but it always makes me giggle. A. Lancelot Capability Brown and Gertrude Jekyll were famous garden designers. Or B. Lancelot Capability Brown and Gertrude Jekyll were famous characters in a Sherlock Holmes story. The answer is A. But the answer is not so important as the general sense that Englishness has something to do with gardening and Sherlock Holmes. Here's some others, and I've seriously not made these up. Which of the following is a fundamental principle of British life? A. Extremism. B. Individual liberty. C. Intolerance. Or D. Inequality. Or even better, what are two fundamental principles of British life? A. Only driving your car on weekdays. B. Participation in community life. C. Growing your own fruit and vegetables. D. Tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs. And the last one, which is a fundamental principle of British life? A. A relaxed work ethic. It's definitely not that one. B. Democracy. C. Extremism. Or D. Religious faith. The idea behind British values is that values come from a specifically Christian foundation, but they can be extended into religion in general, values in general, which can be taken with or without Christ. The tone is one of moderation and public reason, the consensus of all reasonable people. Only the outsider, the extremist, would oppose such incontrovertible values. What monster or rhetorical fool is going to declare him or herself against equality, law, democracy, freedom and tolerance? The formulation is deliberately vague on the question of whether these values could have come from any other religion or from a space entirely without religion. The careful fudge papers over the darker history of what I've talked about in earlier work as the rise of the liberal Bible. Basically, the idea is this. In early modernity, the Protestant Bible was rebranded as a distant, remote, or safely removed foundation, a kenotic, self-giving source of freedom and democracy. Christianity was now valued not so much for its content, but for its particular form of self-backgrounding, self-giving, understanding the voice of God as a voice that stood back from law and politics. Christianity, and specifically Protestant Christianity, was understood as a restrainer, a catechon in a sense, able to keep more autocratic religions at bay. The idea that Christianity in the Bible birthed democracy was perhaps as unbelievable for early moderns as it is for the Barrovians, not least because many at the time were reading that same Bible as a template for absolute monarchy. So the contrast of the Moors, Turks, Jews, and at that time also the Catholics, was used to strengthen the idea of this fundamental vague consensus between Protestant Christianity and modern liberal politics. The contrasts were rhetorical, but they were also politically enforced. Anyone who could not take, who could not take the Lord's Supper according to the rites of the Church of England was subject to civil disabilities and barred from public office in the judiciary or parliament. These civil disabilities were only removed amidst heated controversy for Catholics and nonconformists in 1828, for Jews in 1858, and for atheists in 1888. You won't find that on the citizenship test. But I think it's an important fact to know. Nowadays, the darker frictions between Christianity and religions plural are masked, but they remain. So no wonder, given this history, that there's an easy and perhaps even automatic slippage into more ethno-nationalist interpretations of Christianity against other religions, Christianity alone as democracy's founding source and faith. So that's one of my questions for James. Isn't Cameron's statement that we should dare to acknowledge our specifically Christian foundations not so very different to the more ethno-nationalist takes on British values by Theresa May? The history of the liberal Bible, I think, helps us to understand why a specifically Christian foundation is so important to those who seek the return of full-blooded, right-winged, caffeinated Christianity with crusades and Knights Templars and public battles against Islam, but also to those who support Christianity past, the distant source, the good ghost, that alone can preserve our freedoms and the founding separation of church and state. To return to some points that David made earlier, I think there's still a very tangible relationship between religion and race, or what we now call more politely ethnicity, that representation of genealogies and religious or linguistic affinities that is not quite, but also not race. James powerfully shows how words like cult, sect, Puritans, fanatics, belief and church have been used as damning pejoratives in politics, especially when referring to the sect of the Corbynites and Corbyn's wide-eyed, often young and impressionable believers. No better way to discredit an opponent than to relate him or her to that old other of public reason and politics, belief, and the dangers of the shrieking, fanatical tones of belief. When Enlightenment thinkers defined the space of public reason, law and politics, they argued mostly that it was founded on a Christian moral foundation, but that it was also, paradoxically, separated from the rogue forces of that enemy of reason called belief. One of my favourite illustrations of this, and that I use a lot when teaching, is the frontispiece of the Bible of the Enlightenment, the Encyclopedia, from the mid-18th century. You can't see very clearly, but each of these lovely girls, clutching accessories from compasses, set squares, cacti, microscopes to harps, masks and puppets, represents a different sphere of knowledge. And this is the really interesting part at the top. At the top is truth, wearing a veil. Below her is reason, wearing a crown. Below her, on her knees, and with her open Bible, is Miss Theology, or a Miss Belief. And to her right is Miss Philosophy, who has an anxious eye and a restraining hand on Miss Belief. Miss Belief seems to need surveillance. She seems cut off from everything going on around her. We have no idea what's being intimated to her through supernatural media or her open Bible. She might speak in tongues, in improper, incomprehensible tones, outside the reasonable tones of consensus. She might shriek. She might be silent and keep secrets. In contrast to public reason, she incarnates the danger of belief. But I think this old story is now well out of date. As Michel de Certeau was already observing back in 1984, it's way too late in the day to imagine that the reserves of belief are limitless, and that our task is still to create islands of rationality in the endless seas of belief. Our faith in knowledge, in the empirical, has led us to a depoliticized and ethically numbed politics based on the esoteric numerology of the economy. An undone demos, or repeat the old mantras of democracy like the relics of former convictions. So in this context, I argue, we need more improper tones, more interruptions from old religious languages, more fanaticism, more belief, and more believers. And I think James would agree.